It's really good to be home tonight. It's like I grew up in Sunnyvale, part of Silicon Valley, and I went to school here in Berkeley for one of my college years, and ever since then, anytime I drive into Berkeley, it feels like you're home. If I'm in one of those two places, I feel like I'm in the home where I grew up. And what a great time. I lived in Norton Hall and walked down to Top Dog to have this event catered by Top Dog. I mean, you couldn't do better. I always like to pull pranks. I'm doing them all the time. I've done a few here in Berkeley already today, but I had this idea once for the Stanford Chancellor. And the whole idea was to somehow kidnap him or trick him into a meeting with a dentist that was going to clean his teeth. But the dentist would then emblazon "Go Bears" on his teeth in blue and gold, and a little nitrous oxide so we could, tattoo his nose and put it on the internet, and then hypnotize him so that anytime he heard the phrase terrorist, he'd say "Go Bears." Well, I've never been a professor. It's interesting. You look up, now I know what it's like. I did a lot of electronics kid, and that was where you build stuff all the time. You open up magazines, you get little inexpensive parts, you hook them together with glue called solder, and you make your own little stuff. And there were a bunch of kids in my neighborhood that did this sort of stuff, so we hung around together, and we were all electronic kids, building devices and getting walkie-talkies and things. And back in those days, there were companies that sold surplus parts. Any big manufacturer buys a lot of parts, and they always have extras left over. Bins and bins. When I was in school, they'd take us down to Hewlett Packard and show us rooms full of junk that was good stuff that they were just going to give away to employees or to schools or to somebody. They never quite knew where. And they often wound up in these stores called surplus stores. And surplus stores would sell tons of electronics parts. And there was a guy on our block that had worked in a surplus store, had run one. And he had all this stuff in his garage. So when we did the gardening, we were young kids doing the gardening in his lawn, instead of being paid in cash, we'd say, open up your garage door. We'd look at all these mayonnaise jars full of parts of resistors and capacitors and batteries and things. Oh, that looks cool. Give us those. So we would get paid in parts. It was just more important to us than money, living this little electronic life. One time we built a house-to-house intercom, and we laid the wire down the fence and across the yard, and we went down to Sunnyvale Electronics on our bike and bought microphones and speakers and buzzers, and we could buzz each other in the middle of the night to open up our windows and sneak out and go toilet paper houses and things like that. House-to-house intercom on our own. And it was so neat. We did it all with no parental suggestion, no parental know-how. Matter of fact, one of the people on the fence cut our wire into about 50 places. So what we did was we ran the wire on the other side of the fence of his house. And, just kids thinking, you do what's interesting, you don't know about laws and property rights and those sort of things. And it was so neat that we could press a button and it'll buzz Bill down in his house. And that was like reaching further out. It's like remote control. We were in charge of the world, and all the kids in school that didn't know electronics didn't get to share this magical dream and this big upcoming existence. And we'd buy lots of electronic kits, and generally you'd put the parts together yourself, solder them all together, and build things in those days. The hi-fi in our home. My father had bought a hi-fi from a company called Heath Kit, and it came as kits. Bags of parts that you put together and make your own working hi-fi. And hi-fi in those days was moving from monaural to stereo and getting better and better quality and fidelity and more low frequencies and more high frequencies. Quality was the big thing until MP3s came along. And then we'd rather have the convenience. Well, when I was in about 6th grade, I read a book by accident, nobody gave it to me, called SOS at Midnight, and the heroes were ham radio operators. Ham operators were noted for knowing how radio electronics worked and setting up their own devices with Morse code and with voice, and they would always jump in when there was an emergency in the world, a hurricane on some tropical island. They would start dishing out messages to get communication with people, and we were the do-gooders. We were protecting the airwaves from bad, spurious signals. And I read this book, and at the end of it, it said, you can get a ham radio license, so here's how you do it. And I said, oh my God, you don't have to be 16 years old like a driver's license. Anybody can do it. So I went and I got a ham radio license by studying. Nobody else in my school around me did it. My parents didn't do it. All on my own, I decided to do this. And I got a kit for Christmas, a transmitter kit and a receiver kit, hundreds of parts that you solder together and bolt things into place and run little cords for dials. And it was like such a neat discovery. And with ham radio, you could make contact with other cities, with other states, with other countries. It's like that reaching out, and it makes you feel like you're a Superman. And nobody else in the school did this, so I was all alone. And I felt it was my little specialness. I went to a thing my mom dragged me to once, and Richard Nixon was running for governor in California. And I was a little joker even then. And I took a sign and it said, ham radio operators of Sarah's school, it's an elementary school, unanimously support Richard Nixon for governor. The unanimously being the joke. All of a sudden, 20 flashbulbs went off, and I was on the front page of the San Jose Mercury representing a school group that they didn't get it was a joke. And the best kind of jokes are when they don't know it's a joke. When you tell a joke and they think it's somehow real. It's like I was just at a meeting with a bunch of engineering professors, and my assistant had an appendectomy last week, and I said, oh yeah, she just had an appendectomy today, and she walked out, and here she is. They said, whoa, that's macho. Well, that's a technique. Lockheed and NASA grew up in Silicon Valley, and they were so important to the development of the transistor industry, the early transistor companies, and the move towards chips. And the move towards chips was really spurred because imagine that you're in a space race with Russia and you're trying to go into space. In the early days, every fraction of a gram equated to so many tens of thousands of today's dollars that if you could put 6 transistors on one chip for the same weight, the same mass, you had a big benefit in terms of money. And Lockheed was building stuff for the military, like launching missiles out of submarines. NASA was heading into space, and they were the only ones who could afford to buy this new technology, where a single chip with a single decision-making device called a gate, 3 transistors maybe, would cost, of today's dollars, maybe 500 of today's dollars. Nobody could afford that. It takes $1 million to build a computer. How could you ever build a computer with that price? So they weren't for normal people. They were for the military, the people who could pay for it, financed by the government. My dad, working at Lockheed, was close to the starting companies. He took me to a show when I was 10 years old, and there were booths showing off products of, making components for electronic devices. And this one guy showed a picture that looked like a bunch of houses on a street looking down on it. And he said, these are 6 transistors. We're going to make a chip with 6 transistors on it. Wow, it might have been Gordon Moore himself that was showing me this when I was a young kid. How incredible to go back and have memories of seeing this such an important transition from the transistor on down. Everything often starts in one place, and everything funnels out from it for decades and decades of development. So I was able to get some cosmetic reject transistors from some of the transistor companies. And I accidentally picked up a journal in our house, and the journal talked about binary, a system of ones and zeros for mathematics. And I said, my God, these ones and zeros are as easy for a 5th grader as math in school is. You don't need complicated math. You don't need geometry, trigonometry, calculus, all these exotic things we've heard of. All you need is a normal young student could understand everything about zeros and ones. And they have decision-making devices called gates. Decision-making devices that follow rules. And each one of them electronically was very, very simple to understand. And I said, my God, this is my secret for the rest of my life. I am going to love computers and everything about them. And I don't know why. I'm never going to have a job doing this. Jobs are only in some weird places called research, wherever those are. And so I'm never going to be working with computers. But God, it's so neat to study them and understand them. Well, one year for a science fair project, I took hundreds of transistors and resistors and diodes, pounded nails into a big piece of plywood, soldered all the transistors to the nails. Every transistor made one decision, one rule in the game of tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe, you can never lose if you follow a good set of rules. If there's an X here and an X there and an O there, where do you move? It's all a set of rules that will guarantee you never lose, except you can be beaten psychologically. People can trick you into losing, but built that device. I had no idea that I was taking exactly the right steps up this nice smooth ladder that leads up to the Apple II and things like that. Now, my rewards, why was I interested in this computer logic stuff? None of the kids in school did it. My parents didn't do it. I didn't do it with teachers. It was just my own interest. Well, there are 2 kinds of rewards. Extrinsic rewards and intrinsic rewards. And extrinsic rewards are on the outside, the ones that people can see. They can see your title, they can see your salary, they can see how many yachts you have, they can see your awards, your grades in school. But the intrinsic rewards are the ones that are in your own head, and they matter the most. Who are you really? What are you really going to stand for? And what's really important to you? And, you know, the fact that you're getting satisfied with computers, learning about them, that's an intrinsic reward that's much more powerful than even grades in school. By high school, we had a great electronics teacher, great classes teacher, military guy. He wrote the course himself. We did more slide rule calculations in our electronics class in high school than you had in physics or chemistry. I mean, it was just wonderful for somebody like me, so mathematical, and I loved numbers, and I was this slide rule whiz in my high school. And usually in electronics, it's like a vocational course, and the top academic students don't take it. But a few of us top academic students would take electronics, and we were the ones, you know, kind of more superior, like engineers. The teacher, in my case, I had so much electronics experience from ham radio and a whole bunch of digital science fair projects, including adders, subtractors, and all that, that my teacher said, you already know all the electronics here, and you're just going to play pranks and wire other people's radios up so they explode. So I've arranged for you to go down to a company once a week outside of the school. He went beyond the school boundaries. You know, I never saw any other teachers that did that. Most teachers say, here's what we have to teach. Here are our books, and here's what the learning is, and you go find the extra on your own. But this teacher every year helped a few students get into business, kind of on a co-op basis. So I got to go down to Sylvania once a week and program a thing called a computer. We didn't have computers in high school then, so this was, wow, I was like the most important person in the world. My dream in life, computers, I got to program one. What can a computer do? 1,000,000 things a second. A computer can count 1,000,000 times a second. How fast can a human being count? Figure it out, and it takes you, 2 weeks if you don't go to sleep, and you might count to 1,000,000, but I doubt it. So this computer can do it in 1 second. How powerful. One of my first programs I wrote was the Knight's Tour, where a knight piece on a chessboard tries to hit every square exactly once and not twice. And then you get stuck and bouncing around randomly, and you back up and you try a different approach, and back up and try a different approach, and you'll get the solution. And I wrote the program, and it would do 1,000,000 things a second and get the answer. And nothing came out. And the next week I printed chessboards, and I finally saw that my program was good, but it was going to take 10 to the 25th years to solve. Which is a very good early example of raw speed, raw power in a computer isn't how you solve a lot of problems that are simple, and especially problems that are complex. You need good approaches that come from the mind. You need good methods, good algorithms. While I was down, I discovered that year, in my senior year of high school, I discovered mini computers, what they were about. Mini computers were big boxes with lights that had A0, A1, A2, A3, all these geeky sounding nomenclature. And it's a front panel, and it's like the old computers that you see glorified in movies, and you're afraid. If you walked up and you were a normal person, and maybe half the people in this audience are normal people and half might be engineers or vice versa. We might have some business people here, I'm told. So then you'd walk up and you would say, I would not ever dare touch that machine because I wouldn't know one thing about one button that I'm pressing that somehow says, arrow to memory or something. And so that's what these machines were. They were very sterile. They looked like they belonged on a factory floor. But I accidentally discovered a manual that described the architecture of one. Imagine that you have a lot of experience with lumber, and I had a lot of experience with logic at the time, and you have a design of a building with certain windows and doors and rooms. Well, you could theoretically start to put down the pieces of lumber you're familiar with and construct a drawing of that building. Similarly, I took chip manuals of the day, and chips were pretty weak back then, one gate on a chip, and I would design on paper my version of this computer that I now had a description of its architecture, the PDP-8. And it took me quite a few weeks, quite a few tries, and on weekends I would shut the door in my room. I was a very shy person then, wouldn't involve anyone else. I'd sit on my white table, and I'd just start trying to teach myself, how would you design a computer? No books, no reference materials. They didn't sell books on how computers were made in stores back then. And I eventually designed this computer. And then I thought, wow, what about other mini computers? So a friend and I thought, I'm so interested in computers, but there's no books in the technical library. Where would you find a good technical library? Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. I hate to use the word. Um, Stanford Linear Accelerator Center had some of the brightest minds. They would surely have manuals on computers there. So a friend and I drove in on a Sunday so we wouldn't get caught. And we kind of figured out where the main building was, and we discovered that wherever real bright people work, they tend to leave doors unlocked. So, so we every single Sunday we went there, we'd climb stairs and find a door unlocked somewhere. We'd get into the building, go to the library, and I would read magazines for engineers on computers. And I could fill out little cards and order manuals for the Varian mini computers of the day, for the Hewlett-Packard mini computers of the day, for the digital equipment mini computers of the day. And every time I got a manual that described the architecture of a computer, close my door at home on a weekend, and start designing my version of it. After a while, I made a game. How can I do this better and better and better? Kind of like seeking perfection. How can I be better than I ever was? Strange ideas in my head, ways to use parts of gates that were supposed to be something called a register, but use it as something else called an inverter just because it will work, even though it's not designed that way. Everything I could to save parts. And I thought, engineering is all about efficiency. So many times we're looking for output divided by input, getting the most out for the least in. And to me, that was, if something is very short and simple, be it a program, be it hardware, fewer parts was more valuable. And it just became a little game. And I got very, very good at this. I looked at my designs, and they were like half as many chips as the companies that were shipping the computers. And, it's kind of like, when you create energy these days. Energy is one of the big engineering problems in the near future. It's like we've got to look at how can we get a little more efficiency, a little more energy out of some molecules, out of the sunlight, whatever, to make some of the new advances, the green advances go. A company came out with a mini computer this company started up called Data General. They had the Nova mini computer. And it was one of those rectangular boxes with a front panel, switches for ones and zeros, and buttons to push them into memory. And had a very different architecture than all the others. I sat down one weekend, closed my door, and started designing my chips into this computer, the Data General Nova. And it took half as many chips as all the other mini computers. And I was stunned. And I came to a realization, if you design an architecture exactly matching the parts that are available, you can use very few parts and have just as good a computer. And that stuck with me for the rest of my life. That was going to be my philosophy of what good design was, very few parts. I told my father, someday I'm going to own a 4K Nova computer so I can write programs. And he said, that'll cost as much as a house. And I said, I'll live in an apartment. I would rather have a computer in my life than a house. I was lucky to get either, but no, computers, well, Moore's Law took care of that. Alrighty, my first year of college, computer courses in most colleges, all but a very, very few, were graduate courses only. Introduction to Computers was a graduate course. And I was enrolled in engineering, so I was allowed to take it. And wow, I got to write Fortran programs. It was a great course. I learned a lot. I got an A+, and I got to write Fortran programs. So I started writing programs that calculated tables of numbers. I had 7 programs that calculated things like powers of 2, Fibonacci numbers. They would print 60 pages of output and stop before I got kicked off the computer, and then punch out the cards so I could substitute some punch cards in, run it again, and get the next 60 pages in order. And the next 60 pages, and the numbers were growing until they were longer than a whole page, and I was piling up reams of output in my dorm room, 7 programs a day, 3 runs a day on the supercomputer at our campus, times 60 pages each, and they stopped my programs from running. And I got put on probation for what I call computer abuse. But it turns out I didn't realize, I thought when you signed up for a computer class, you got to use the computer. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that there was a little structure in the background called budgets. And I ran our class 5 times over budget for computer use, and it was more than out-of-state tuition. So that was a good year because electronics, people that don't know electronics, you can have an awful lot of fun with them. Or imagine if they don't know computers, the little tricks you can put onto their screen that might come up, and what is going on here, the fun you can have. Well, I went down to Radio Shack and bought a high-speed transistor. I wound a coil and put a little capacitor on, designed up a little tiny transmitter that would jam TV signals. And the black and white TVs in our dorm, it would jam just real good. I tested it. So I went over to this hall, Libby Hall, and down in the basement they had a color TV. And sit in the back, and I finally jammed it a little, and it fuzzed up the picture. It didn't really jam it just fuzzed it up. A friend of mine in the front row, without even any planning, whacked the TV. So I made it go good. And then after a while, I would jam it, and he would whack it, and it would go good. And it was amazing to watch this effect, because I hadn't planned it, but it was like a psychology experiment. And for 2 weeks, they put one person next to the TV set every night. Whenever the picture went bad, he had to turn the controls or whack it till it went good. And sometimes, one time, they held the antenna up in the air to make it good. And eventually, they had to stand on a chair. Another time, one guy had his hand on the middle of the screen. 3 guys were fixing the TV. One guy had his hand on the middle of the screen and a foot up in the air on a chair. And I made it go good. And eventually, they relaxed, and it went bad. And they said, put your bodies back where they were. Because by now, they were sure that where their bodies were made the TV work. Eventually, he put his hand on the TV, and it worked. And he put his foot down on the floor, and it failed. And he put his foot back up on the chair, and it worked. He turned to the audience and announced, it's a grounding effect. I think he was an electrical engineer. Because they were going to charge, they acted like they were going to charge me so much to go back. They scared me away from that school. And the next year, I went to college in Cupertino. And a friend of mine worked in the computer room with the IBM 360 Model 40. And he had copied the key to the room. So we would go in at midnight. To me, have you ever watched Happy Gilmore, any of you? The ball wants to go in the hole. The hole is your home. Well, a computer sitting there at night, unused, wants to compute, doesn't it? So we go in at midnight and put paper in front of the terminals that shows the jobs. And I'd run programs late into the night, 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And we'd close things up and go back home. So that was a great year. I just wanted to write every program I could, take every course I could, even ones that wouldn't carry credit to Berkeley. Next year, I didn't have money for Berkeley, so I took a year off to work and earn the money for my 3rd year of college. Walked into a door by accident, and they were building a medium-sized computer. This computer was going to run the DMV, 2 of them, for the next 20 years. It was that good a computer. And I got a job there programming. And while I was there, I mentioned to one of the engineers how I used to design computers back in high school. I would design all the mini computers. And he said, did you ever build one? I said, no, I could never get the parts. I could never afford them. And he said, well, he had connections with chip companies, and he would get me some parts if I designed a computer. So I went home and designed a very minimal computer and came back the next day, and he gave me the parts. And I went home, and it took about a week or 2 to wire it up down the street. This friend of mine, we were wiring it in his garage. He said, you've got to meet this guy, Steve Jobs. He goes to the same high school as us, and he's into the things you're into. He knows digital electronics and things that have counters and numbers on them, and he likes to play pranks at school. So Steve came over, and we're sitting there on the sidewalk, sizing each other up. You know, he played a couple of nice pranks, with phones on some lines that were in tunnels under the school that I didn't know about, and I had tons and tons of my own pranks, and then we talked about our electronics, and I talked about my computer designs and all that, and so we became best friends for the next 8 years. He had a nice home and family, his mother, father, sister. I didn't realize they were adopted. I didn't realize he didn't like his dad. His dad was always showing us lasers from where he worked and interesting stuff. I thought the sort of stuff that you'd be interested in, and I thought his dad was really nice, but Steve didn't get along with him that well. Steve had worked selling surplus parts at a local surplus parts dealer. And he would sometimes discover somebody that had a bunch of parts for 6 cents that he could sell for $6 each. And he'd make a purchase of 100 parts and make money like that. And I thought, whoa, that just sounds a little wrong. You get it for 6 cents and sell it for $6. Why wouldn't you tell the person you're selling it to what it cost you? And another thing that Steve did back in high school, he talked to me that the first meeting we ever had, he talked to me about how he and some friends had made a movie, frame by frame, claymation, animation movie. So, you never hear about that. When you hear about Pixar, yeah, he did, it started way back early in his life. He'd also read a book, and he said that there were a few special people, the Einsteins and the Newtons, that moved our progress forward in the world. moved life forward, and there were only very few of those. And in this book, all the rest of the people kind of didn't matter. They didn't make any difference to how history went. And Steve always talked like he wanted to be one of those special people that were the ones, moving the world in a forward direction. Um, well, and I kind of agree with that. You know what? If you don't want to solve problems or move the world forward, you're not gonna. You have to want to. Having the want and the desire, the inspiration to do something very important. I taught elementary school for 8 years. After Apple, I did it quietly with no press, but it was more important to inspire the students to want to learn than it was to actually teach them material. The company that I was working for, making that great computer that they sold to the state of California, went bankrupt. There was a big recession. They went bankrupt. They had a great computer, all done, operating systems, languages, incredible hardware. And it was difficult to understand, how can you make a product successfully, a good product, and still go bankrupt? That always bothered me. Headed off to a great year at Berkeley. Oh my God. Little bit on the prank side. This was back in the Vietnam days, and we had demonstrations that came down, Shattuck and Bancroft, and broke every single window in every single store, and the cops were shooting rubber bullets, and it was always fun to find one. And I kept trying. I like to do the things you could never get a chance to do again in your life. So I always wanted to go out there when they were about to throw a tear gas canister. I always wanted to run over and get somebody to take my picture by the tear gas canister going off. Never quite succeeded. Now, did I ever have an engineering schedule for Berkeley? I was now a junior, and I could sign up for the courses I wanted. So I took a couple of grad courses in hardware design and a couple in software design. They were all in the same room in Quarry Hall, all 4 of my courses. And on Monday and Wednesday, I'd go to this classroom, the same classroom, sit in the same chair for 2 classes in a row. On Tuesday and Thursdays, I'd go to that same chair and sit for 2 classes in a row, and none of my classes started before noon. Always in the same chair. You just couldn't write that into a book. Steve Jobs was coming up a lot to visit me in the dorms, and I'd drive down to him, and we had discovered these little devices that if you put tones into an American telephone, you could make free calls all over the world. And it was a little startling, and it wasn't like, I was careful that I wouldn't make any of my own phone calls that way, but I sure did explore the system. How far can you get? How do you get to these international operators and talk them into connecting you through satellite to another international operator and around the world, and you talk in one phone and hear yourself a second later? It was just so interesting. So that was the first time Steve took one of my designs and he said, let's sell it. And so we actually sold some of those here. After that year at Berkeley, I had totaled my car. It's a great page in my book, The Night I Met Captain Crunch. I'm not going to go through it. It's the best few pages in the book for a great story. But I didn't have the money. I totaled my car and didn't have the money for my 4th year of college, so I went to work for a year, supposedly 1 year. Didn't drop out of college. And the hottest product in the world, I managed to buy one with all the money I did have. It was the HP 35 scientific calculator, the first handheld scientific calculator of all time, the one that was going to put slide rules out of existence in a couple of years. This was every single engineer, every scientist had to get this calculator, because instead of slide rules, you could type in 10-digit numbers and see digital answers and get them instantly and immediately and accurately. And for engineers, this product changed the world. Somehow, HP heard that I was some hot computer designer, and they brought me in for interviews and hired me as an engineer designing the calculators. So what an incredible chance in life to be on, the hot moving products of the world, get to work there. It's like if you loved Apple products so much and you got a job at Apple. So my job was designing the digital logic inside of chips and then laying out, doing some chip layouts actually. And I would go and use the computer. We had one Hewlett-Packard mini computer and teletypes and big apparatus that we all shared. So 40 of us engineers would sign up for time slots, get on the computer, run our programs, and I would write simulations that simulated my designs, ones and zeros, bit by bit, and see how they came out and make sure they worked. So that's what I would do on that computer. And I kind of, would have loved to have my own computer, but that comes a hair later. Our calculators at Hewlett-Packard used what was called reverse Polish notation. Anybody know what reverse Polish notation is? Anybody who's been through computer software or algorithm expression solutions knows that RPM, you put in, if you want to add two numbers, you put the two numbers in first, and then you say add them. And that's how our calculators work. And it was like things that computer scientists do who are writing computer languages. So we thought our calculators are more sophisticated, more computer science, more powerful and macho than normal calculators where you say 2 plus 3. And we had a big equation on a card that we could solve with our calculators. But boy, was it hard. I tried over and over. It had so many subterms, this minus that squared. And it was kind of like the big statistics problems. I could solve it on my calculator. Texas Instruments introduced a new calculator. They came out with a calculator that used parentheses instead of reverse Polish notation. Parentheses 5 plus 3, parentheses times 6. And this parentheses told you what order to do things in for a long equation. And we laughed at it. We said parentheses make it a toy. The same way people were going to someday say graphics makes the Macintosh a toy. And we laughed at it in Hewlett-Packard. And they brought the calculator over by my cubicle, and about 6 engineers were standing around, and one marketing guy, and I said, hey, I'll try the big equation. We had this big card. I said, I'll try it, because I thought of myself as being pretty smart. And I sat down there and looked at the equation and saw, here's the term you do first. So I have to hit about 6 parentheses, or is it 7? And I'm thinking, there's no way in the world I'm ever going to get this straight. No human could do this. And I did something that's very important that a lot of people have trouble doing. Cleared my head out. You pretend you don't know anything. What would you do? There has to be a way. Wait a minute. Why don't I type it in from left to right? I typed in the equation from left to right as fast as I could go, guessing if square root was prefix or postfix, first or last, and got the right answer the first time. And the other engineers were kind of stunned. How do you do that? And I handed it to each of them, and I said, type it in from left to right. I couldn't get one other engineer to type it in from left to right, parentheses and everything. They all wanted to use the skill that they had built up of looking at a complicated expression, figuring out which part to do first and which part to do second, and wanting to do them in that order. You don't want to give up a skill sometimes, so you miss spotting when something comes along that's easier and simpler. Why have 2 languages, one for the calculator, one for handwritten expressions? Steve Jobs around this time wanted to go to Reed College because one of those special people in the world that got a Nobel Prize was at Reed College. And I drove Steve up to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, visited him quite a few times in the next months. And the first day he got there, he brought a card to me. He said, look, here's the classes they're telling me I have to take. And I looked at it, and it was literature, and calculus, and, or some kind of math and history. It was the normal stuff that you take. And I said, yeah, that's what you get when you